I am beyond thrilled to be here. I think this is the third summer I've come to do training for all of you, and the group has just exploded. And I think that's such a testament not only to GHC, but also to you all as young people who are at the forefront of this global health equity movement. So I'm beyond thrilled. I look forward to this every summer. So I know it's after lunch. I am exhausted. I got my coffee here, and I know you all are sleepy because I was looking at your agenda of all the hard work you're putting in to get ready for your fellowship. So please, let's have a conversation as opposed to me talking at you until 3:30, because otherwise I'm going to fall asleep. You guys are going to fall asleep. And you're such an interesting group. It would be great to have a dialogue, and that certainly makes it more fun for me. So when Barbara emailed me back in March, I don't even know if you remember, you said there are a number of topics or themes that we'd love to ask you to speak on, specifically health and social innovation in the U.S. It would be great if you could also share your story or path to a career in social entrepreneurship, as well as your perspectives on public service and leadership. So I'm sort of a last-minute kind of gal. So I was like on the train trying to figure out what I was going to talk about. So it's kind of fluid, and we'll kind of figure it out as we go. But I think I will sort of start off by maybe talking about social movements in the U.S. and how it relates to changes in the healthcare system. I'm not a global health expert. I've not practiced clinical medicine in like 15 years, but I do know something about social movements, and it's really interesting what's happening here in the U.S. around healthcare. So I'll spend a few minutes talking about that. I then think I will spend a few minutes talking to you all as next-gen leaders about how I think, or Echoing Green thinks, you might go about your own professional development, your own leadership development journeys over the next couple of years, because you all have a lot of work to do since a lot of my generation messed up a bunch of stuff. So you all are going to be very busy over the next couple of decades, but you really do have a lot to think about as you all are beginning your careers. And then I will talk a little bit about social entrepreneurship, the movement I'm involved in. It's really interesting, and of course I want you all to know about Echoing Green, because one day if you all decide to start something and are looking for seed funding, we want you all to come to us. So hopefully that's okay. Raise your hand, shout out, and we'll just sort of have a conversation. All right, so let's start talking about healthcare, social movements. I actually think the U.S. is a really interesting historical example for a couple of reasons. So, let me start by saying that there have been many grassroots movements in my country, in the U.S., civil rights movement, women's movement, LGBT movement, and as part of these grassroots movement, all of them, in one shape or form, have demanded changes in the healthcare system. And they were very specific. So, for example, part of the genius and impact of the civil rights movement was fighting for, racial desegregation of hospitals. Really important part of the movement. So for women, there was a whole reproductive rights movement, the whole notion of access to contraception, access to abortion, and if you all have been paying attention to the news, that is still an ongoing struggle that is playing out in real time in this country. The LGBT movement, there's been a lot of activism of people with AIDS and HIV around, release of experimental AIDS drugs early, pharmaceutical price reductions, large increases in AIDS research and funding. So there's really been an incredibly robust, exciting level of activity around changes to the healthcare system. And I think part of your job as global health leaders is to really become students of history and students of social movements. So why, in part, have we seen so much activity in this country around grassroots movements in general, people who are focusing on changes to the healthcare system specifically? And in part, it really does stem from sort of the founding principles and ideas of this country. So when you look at our founding documents, from Declaration of Independence, Bill of Rights, Constitution, enshrined in those documents are principles, ideals, language around access to, happiness, liberty, self-governance. And for the past couple hundred years, people in our country, the marginalized, the dispossessed, the at-risk, have looked to those founding documents, those principles, and have used it as a rallying cry, a beacon call for their own advancement. So there's something really intrinsic to the DNA of this country about what we aspire to as a nation and what the dispossessed think they deserve as they work towards full citizenship in this country. So I think that's a really important mechanism to keep in mind when you all are going out into the world to be part of this global health movement. Sort of what fuels it? You need to be constantly questioning, what is the fuel behind this? What is catalyzing the work that we do? And good grassroots movement leaders are always looking for those tools, those mythologies, those hagiographies that they can use to propel their movements forward. So that's one thing. But another thing, especially for those of you who are from other countries who are going back to work over the next year as part of your fellowship on global health issues, take some time to sort of read what's happening here in this country around the fight around Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act. Like, this stuff is really fascinating. It's playing out in real time. And if you were sort of just swooping in for the first time saying, wow, look at this political fight. On one side, there are people who are trying to expand access to the 50 million plus uninsured folks in the U.S. You know, when I started medical school 20-some years ago, there were like 30 million Americans who were without health insurance. It has exploded to 50 million people, right? But you could sort of see by the intensity, in some ways the nastiness of the debate around health care reform, that it just seems new, it just seems really raw and fresh. In fact, this has been going on for over 100 years. And again, I think it's kind of instructive. Let's look at the arc of this fight for universal health care coverage, because it goes all the way back to the early 20th century. And again, as students of history, as future leaders, it's really good to dig in, because I think we can all learn by that which has gone before us. All right, so let's start back in like the early 1900s. So at the time, you got the Industrial Revolution. You have large numbers of Americans who are sort of toiling away in urban centers, in factories and other industrial settings. And at the time, when working folks like that, when they got sick, it was bad enough that they got sick, but they also lost their wages, right? So the link between sickness and lost income was absolutely critical. And the fact that this loss of income was a major factor in large-scale poverty in this country really was a big impetus around individuals, burgeoning labor unions to start fighting for a system of mandatory health insurance to protect workers against this wage loss and these medical costs. All right, so that was 1915s, and you've got groups like the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, AFL, and others trying to push for this. Didn't really go anywhere, and then by the 1920s, even through like the 1940s, the movement shifted a little bit, because in this country, as technology and medical care became more effective and more technologically sophisticated, it also became more expensive. So increasingly, you had folks who were like, okay, not only when I get sick and I miss a couple days at work, I'm losing my wages, which impacts my family and pushes us into poverty. The ability of the average citizen to engage with the healthcare system got even more perilous because it was getting more expensive. And I think at this point, it's instructive. I want you, again, you got to really look at the architecture, the structures of social movements, and how interests butt heads against one another. Because you all are going to find it if you stay in the global health equity movement or any movement of which you're a part in the future. So, for example, look, I'm a doctor. I was never a member of the American Medical Association. I had my own issues with them as an entrenched special interest. But, when you look at the history of groups like the American Medical Association, they were always against universal health care coverage, which seems odd. It's a helping profession. These are doctors. Why wouldn't they want to get more folks insured, especially the least enfranchised in our society? But you got to look at these groups like the AMA as an entrenched special interest. They were worried about the impact of health reform on their incomes, their status in society. Doctors were one of the most elite groups. So you really got to look at it from an analytical perspective. You also have to put stuff in historical context. So when all this was sort of playing out in the 40s and 50s, I wasn't around. I mean, you guys certainly weren't around, but say like, my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, smack dab in the Cold War era. And sort of what's happening around you all in real time affects what is possible and what is not. And at the time, sort of the Cold War ethos, the desperate concern of Americans about the fear of the Red Scare really made it difficult for healthcare reform to progress, because people thought about it as an encroachment of socialized medicine, of communism. So again, you got to look at the historical context. And then the last thing I'll say is that there are real structural barriers that impede any movement. And I actually think what labor unions, I'm pro-labor unions. Both my parents were public school teachers who were members of unions. And I think unions, for the most part, are forces for good. But when you look at the arc of health care reform, unions during the 20s, 30s, and 40s were so busy focused on winning health benefits through collective bargaining, through private companies, as opposed to focusing on governmental reforms, that a lot of the energy was sucked away from grassroots organizing, focused on federal action, and more towards sort of private employer union negotiation, that it made the push for national reform efforts less urgent. So I know I'm getting a little in the weeds, but again, I really implore you all, as you're going out in the world, to think about global health equity. It's not just about the work you're going to be doing at your healthcare organization. It is part of a larger context, and to be most effective, you got to understand that really well. I'll fast forward a little bit. For those of you who are students of the civil rights movement, the 60s, 50s, 60s were an incredibly important time for a lot of impactful changes in this country, especially for folks who look like me. So the whole push for President Johnson's war on poverty, including the creation of the Medicare program, which is one of the most effective social safety net programs this country has ever seen, was important not only for protecting senior citizens from catastrophic illness and poverty, but it also helped to create a permanent constituency for health care reform that really has continued until today. And then, interestingly enough, by the time we get to the 70s, there was an incredible amount of inflation in health care costs. Became prohibitively expensive. It was a very difficult time. But instead of our federal institutions, our state institutions sort of focusing on expanding coverage, there was more focus on containing costs. And by the time we get to the 1980s, and again, that's when I was heading off to medical school, you're getting larger and larger number of Americans who are uninsured. This has real implications across our country. And I would say, I was in graduate school at the time. I remember, taking time off from class to go hear an unknown governor, a guy named Bill Clinton, talk about wanting to run for the presidency. Were you all even born? Okay, you were like in diapers or you were babies, but I remember thinking, oh, this guy is really interesting. He's talking about, part of his appeal was his commitment to trying to take on the massive healthcare system and all of the structural flaws in it. And in part, it was sort of his call to action to reform the healthcare system that led to his election in '92. So again, it's part of this larger story, and unfortunately, the story ends when he and his administration actually failed miserably in trying to reform the healthcare system, in part because entrenched interests, the way that it was done inside the Beltway versus engaging large number of grassroots groups, that led, unfortunately, to healthcare reform not being realized during his administration. So that was sort of a very quick and dirty overview of the history of healthcare reform through the lens of social movements. But again, I come at my work from a social justice perspective, and until you can build the kinds of coalitions, until you can sort of understand the power and the promise of social movements, your leadership impact will be limited. So I implore you, like I said, spend part of your year not only doing really great work on the ground with your institutions, but also study up on global health as a burgeoning social movement and how you can apply it to your future career. All right, so that's one thing. So a couple of weeks ago, or maybe it was like a month and a half ago, Time magazine had a very interesting cover, and it had like a young person like you on the cover, and the title was Me, Me, Me. And it was actually kind of a snarky article about you all as millennials, as young people. And the guy who wrote it was probably a guy my age, a guy named Joel Stein, who basically said to the world that you all suffer from narcissistic personality disorder. He said you guys are selfish, all you do is think about yourself, and that you are just consumed with your image. You guys tweet too much. You're on your texting all the time. I don't have kids, but I spend a lot of my time working with young people like you, and I found that outrageous. Like, I feel very privileged to work with next-gen leaders like you all the time, and I actually don't find you to be narcissistic or too consumed by your image at all. I actually am really inspired by the way you all are stepping up and walking into the world with a level of confidence about what you all need to do as next-gen leaders, because there are a lot of very serious, complex problems that it is going to fall to your generation to really make some headway on. So it's interesting, Echoing Green, which I'll talk more about later, mainly is known for the annual fellowship program we run for young social entrepreneurs who are starting innovative new social change organizations. But increasingly over the past couple of years, we focus more and more on a program that we call Work on Purpose. And the idea behind this program was a couple years ago is we said, every year, Echoing Green gets like 3,000, 3,500 of these social business plans. Young people like you from 130 countries submit their ideas for us for social change. We only fund about 20 of these proposals. So, we send away 98% of these really passionate young people without funding, most of whom don't go on to start these organizations, but who are clearly committed to making their world better. So that was a message to us as Echoing Green, recognizing that, okay, we may only fund 20 social entrepreneurs a year, people like Barbara who started GHC, or Julie and Emma who started Gardens for Health International, or Raj or Peter who started Teatide Health. But why couldn't we have a larger conversation with the thousands of young people like you who really want to have careers of impact and meaning? So over the last couple of years, we've worked hard to develop a curriculum we call Work on Purpose. And it includes, and I'll send the link because it's up on our website, and if you got some time, take a look at it. But very quickly, there are 10 principles or competencies that comprise Work on Purpose. And I would suggest to you that over the next year especially, the fellowship is 1 year or 2 years? 1 year, right? So over the next year, like I said, in addition to working hard day in and day out, you really do have a very specific task at hand. You're at the very beginning of your journeys, but you need to figure out who you are and who you plan to be in the world, what you're most passionate about, because passionate and excellence are inextricably linked. When you're working, it's okay to work 15, 20 hours a day when you're passionate about it. It is really hard to do it when you're miserable doing what you're doing. So you really need to figure out what is your sweet spot. Athletes get in the zone. You all need to figure out professionally where is your zone and how are you going to have an impact. What tools you all need to compete and be best in class at what you do. And tools like Work on Purpose will hopefully help you think through that. All right, so let's talk through some of the principles. So the first principles we at Echoing Green talk about as the 3 principles related to what's right for you. So how do you all think about it? So we have a formula that we talk about at Echoing Green called heart plus head equals hustle. So that just means you all need to find out a way to really get in touch with yourself, to figure out what makes your heart skip a beat. What are you really obsessed about? What are you passionate about? What gets you excited? And then also figuring out what are you good at? What technical, what analytical skills are you suited to? Sometimes it's hard to see the forest for the trees. That's why you all should be a wonderful support to one another, because sometimes you're not objective about your own skills as well as your own weaknesses, but use a community like this to pressure test and say, hey, what do you think I'm good at? What did I excel at? What was I not so great at? So heart plus head equals hustle. The second principle is we talk about know what you've got and know what you need. You really do need to figure out what is your unique contribution to the world. And sometimes it takes a long time to figure it out. In the meantime, expose yourself to lots of opportunities like this. Go back to grad school if it makes sense. Volunteer if grad school doesn't make sense. Read a lot. Talk to as many people as you can. And start that process of self-discovery. And last but not least, it's really important to mine, to dig into your past. Really reflect on your history in order to understand what motivates you, both positively and negatively. And that's going to help you sort of get to a career of impact. So I know this is kind of like, does this make sense? I'll use my own story as an example. So I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland. It was a Jewish neighborhood in Baltimore, Maryland in the 60s. It was actually one of the first neighborhoods in Baltimore to desegregate it and to allow African American families to move in. So my dad was the first person in his family to go to college. My mom was the second person in the family to go to college. Public school teachers scraped together $20,000 to buy our house. And when I was 4, we moved into the suburbs of Pikesville, Maryland. So here you've got African American family growing up in a Jewish neighborhood. So loved the holidays because I had, celebrated Hanukkah with my next door neighbors, and I got presents, and we had yummy food for Passover and Rosh Hashanah. And then spent Christmas with my family, my family both sides from North Carolina, so lots of soul food, African-American traditions, interesting sort of dual existence. Also at the time, I went to a predominantly white high school, and I was usually the only African-American in my advanced placement classes, So my existence was sort of sitting in class with my white friends, during lunch, heading over to the lunch table with my African American friends. Again, sort of this very dual existence. And the last piece of example I'll give you is I played violin in high school. I was actually a pretty bad violin player, but you know, I think our orchestra was actually pretty bad. But I played violin for many, many years. So studied Bach, Vivaldi, Beethoven. But again, I'm of the generation of sort of old school hip hop. So I'd be playing my Bach, Vivaldi during the day and was rushing home to this incredible new art form that really transformed my generation, whether it was like you know, Grandmaster Flash or the Furious Five, LL Cool J, who I actually just saw in concert last weekend, bringing back all kinds of great memories. EPMD, got to give it up for old school. So that was my existence, sort of walking this really interesting line where you were sort of inhabiting a bunch of different worlds, but sort of never a part of any completely, right? And that continued when I went off to college. I was the first person in my family to go to an Ivy League school. I went to Harvard College. First person in my family to become a doctor. I went up to Harvard Medical School. And at the time, got really interested in the issue of infant mortality. So the definition of infant mortality is babies who die before their first year of life, right? And for those of you who know anything about Boston, it probably has the best medical facilities in the world. Mass General Hospital, Brigham and Women's, Beth Israel Deaconess. It is the epicenter of the best of the best of the best of medical care. So how is it in the late 80s, early 90s, black babies were dying at 3 times the rate of white babies? So that's bad enough. That's inequity, it's unfair, but in the shadow of the world's greatest medical facility just seem unconscionable to me. So this is, you know, this notion of, you know, head plus heart equals hustle. I was in graduate school sort of learning all the technical skills I needed to be a clinician, a physician, but I became absolutely obsessed with this injustice. Like, you know, the Boston Globe, which was the leading paper in Boston, had this 5-part series in the early 90s called Birth in the Death Zone. And over the course of a week, it traced this issue of black infant mortality. And the first day of the issue was this young woman in her 20s, could be my cousin, could be my sister, like kneeling before the grave of the baby that she just buried. And I can still see the image as clear as day, jeans, black t-shirt, sort of kneeling before this grave. And I could not get it out of my head. You couldn't, if you asked me to explain why, I wouldn't know, but I just became obsessed with it, and I couldn't let it go. And for me, that became sort of the turning point in my life. And it was one of those things, there are tons of problems in the world, that's why you guys are here, and lots of problems you could take on. But for me personally, I couldn't turn away from the issue of black infant mortality in inner city Boston. So I ended up writing an article for the alumni magazine of my medical school, and it came to the attention of an incredible doctor there, African-American woman, Dr. Nancy Oriole, who's now the Dean of Students at Harvard Medical School. And she said, yeah, I read that article too. I'm thinking about trying to do something around this issue. It seems crazy that, you know, the Harvard community would allow something like this to happen. And together we started thinking about this issue and ended up starting a mobile health unit that Barbara mentioned called the Family Van. And we spent, you know, many nights at her kitchen table with her 3 kids screaming, the dog barking, trying to figure out how we were going to make some small difference in this issue. And it really was transformative for me. So again, my story became, okay, your gut, my belief is your gut, you know, there's something really powerful about your gut. I think it is the most powerful form of intuitive data that you will ever have access to, but most of us ignore it. We suppress it, right? And there are a whole host of reasons. We think, you know, you guys are so smart, you live in your head, you don't think that sort of that stuff that lives in your soul, that sort of psychically based is important, but boy, is it really important. And if you listen to your gut, if you analyze it, if you process it, there are a lot of really powerful answers. And again, for me, the connection between black infant mortality and sort of this lifelong dual existence that I live, where I, you know, in one half I saw family members who were sort of just making it, barely out of poverty, to a pretty, you know, wonderful middle-class existence where my parents did their best to expose me to a lot of things, but I just couldn't shake this notion of inequity and justice and lack of opportunity, and it became the driving force for me. I don't think I could articulate it until I was well into my 20s or 30s, but my life experience completely shaped who I am. And one of my favorite exercises that I hope you'll do, like, you all get your business cards. My business card says, I'm president of Echoing Green. 20 years ago, my business card would have said Dr. Cheryl Dorsey because I was trained as an MD. And we start to identify ourselves through our professional degrees and through sort of societal expectations of who we are. I was a doctor, right? But that wasn't what I was great at. And again, it took me many, many years to figure this out. So for me, if I had to do it all over again and I was to hand out my business cards to you all today, my title, my core competency, what I think I'm really, really good at is as a cultural translator, right? I'm someone on the one hand who is as comfortable, like hanging out, listening to EPMD, LL Cool J, Big Daddy Kane, as I am sort of sitting at, New York Philharmonic. Well, I actually like the old school rap better, but I can, if need be, sort of clean myself up and go and sit in these very rarefied environments. I spent my mornings walking the halls of Harvard Medical School, getting exposure to some of the best minds, but spent my afternoons walking across the railroad tracks of Boston into some of the most disadvantaged communities in the city and feeling just as comfortable there as I did in the hallowed halls of Harvard. That's cultural translation. And here I am 20, 30 years later doing the same thing where I spent a lot of my days on Wall Street. I'm talking to Wall Street bankers, I'm talking to financiers, hedge fund managers about why they should give to social entrepreneurship and to next generation leaders like you, as well as spending a lot of my time on the front lines with social justice leaders and incredible organizations like GHC who are on the ground trying to make a difference. But again, cultural translator. They didn't teach me that in school. There's no book that helps you determine. It says you can be a doctor, lawyer, engineer, sort of the traditional pathways. And I think our educational institutions are not set up to help you all figure out this journey. So you're going to have to do a lot of this work yourself and rely on one another to get there. And I got there, but I'm almost 50. I wish somebody had helped me out with this 25 years ago. I think I would have made a bigger difference in the world if I had just figured this out a long time ago. But you all are just at the beginning of your journey. So really focus hard on figuring out who you are, what you're best at. And the last thing I'll say before I move on is, I don't know about you all, I was absolutely sort of type A, totally focused in my 20s, and I really beat myself up a lot. I thought I had to be great at everything or else I was a failure. Like, I had to be as good as I was on like analytical stuff as well as management stuff, and I felt like a total failure if I just wasn't good at stuff. Well, what a waste of time that was for me, because I'm not good at everything. There are a couple things I'm really, really good at, and there's the whole notion of strength finders. If you're wasting like 20, 30, 40% of your time trying to make yourself better at the stuff you're not good at, you're detracting from the stuff you should be focused on, the stuff you're better at than anybody else. So give yourselves a break, I would say. I didn't do that to myself. I was really pretty awful to myself in my 20s. But if I just focused on those few things I was awesome at, I would have rocked it. It would have been amazing. So again, part of your journey is to really focus hard on what you are better at than almost anybody else in the room. And if you all did that, the collective power of what you all are trying to do would just be seismic. So I really encourage you to do that. All right, so a couple more principles before I turn to talk more about social entrepreneurship, and then we'll open it up for questions. So there are a couple of exercises that we talk about at Echoing Green, which are pretty powerful. So Echoing Green, if I had worn my Echoing Green t-shirt today, it would have been like a blank line that says, blank is what matters. So an exercise for folks is, if you had to fill in that sentence, for each of you would be different. For somebody say global health matters. Somebody might say social justice matters. Other people may say politics matters. Doesn't matter. It's what's specific and personal to you. But it is your job to figure out that social problem, prioritize it, and figure out how to understand it better than almost anybody else. And that's a really important exercise, because when you say yes to something, you also say no to a bunch of other things, right? And you all have many options before you, and you can do a lot of different things. You really got to hone in on the thing you'll say yes to, and then be okay with saying no to a lot of other things. Echoing Green also talks about acting on your moment of obligation, right? So I think you all are sort of the best and the brightest. You've been given a lot. And because of that, a lot is going to be expected of you. You've got to be ready to accept responsibility and be accountable for moving the needle on some problem somewhere on the world. And you just got to figure out what that moment of obligation was. I didn't know what that term meant 25 years ago. when I started the family van. But for me, the moment of obligation was to see people of color, low-income people in the most well-resourced country in the world, the fact that they lacked access to services that other people got was unconscionable to me. So that was my moment of obligation. And once that light went on, it became very easy to sort of focus and almost become beautifully obsessed with, in some small way, trying to make a difference on that problem. And then last but not least, it's going to be really important to take perspective, take someone else's perspective on a problem. Very rarely is there a right answer or a wrong answer, and that's why I'll never get involved in the political process, because in some ways, it just seems very frustrating, because it's very often, there's no one way to do it. There are many ways to do it, and I think part of your responsibility is figuring out how to walk in someone else's shoes and how to figure out why their approach may be different from yours, but what is valid in it, and how can you somehow meet in the middle. And I think part of what's going to be amazing for you this year is you all will get to see that alternative perspective, and I hope you'll be open to it, because it will fundamentally and totally make you a better leader. So let me give you another example of that. So a couple weeks ago, I was hanging out with an Echoing Green fellow named Jessamine Rodriguez. And Jessamine started an amazing social enterprise called Hot Bread Kitchen. And Hot Bread Kitchen works out of Harlem. And it's essentially a bakery whose mission it is to work with low-income immigrant women to help them take their traditional baking practices and create products that she then sells through a whole bunch of retail distribution chains. So, only being in existence in 3 years, they're a multi-million-dollar company that creates 25 different products, from granola to lavash to amazing breads baked by women from all over the world who have lifted themselves up and out of poverty by using what they know through their traditional baking practices. So how did Jessamine end up being this pretty incredible social entrepreneur who's been written up in Food and Wine magazine, who was recently just presenting her business plan to the president of Barclays Bank? She's an amazing woman. So the story is actually kind of interesting and I think instructive. So, on Jessamine's Echoing Green t-shirt, for her it says, social justice is what matters. So how did she get to that? So many, many years ago, Jessamine was probably about your age, and she was interviewing for a job at, I don't know if any of you have heard of Women's World Banking. It's a microfinance organization that basically gives small loans to low-income women around the world, part of the microfinance industry. And she had her interview at Women's World Banking. She was so passionate about it. And she got home from the interview, and she told a friend that she had just been at Women's World Banking, and that she was really excited about the opportunity. And her friend thought that she had said she had just come back from Women's World Baking. And Jessamine just said, isn't that just sort of the oddest thing that she misheard me? But for whatever reason, she couldn't get out of her head this weird visual image of Women's World Baking, right? And it just stuck. So Jessamine went on, she didn't get the job, but she went on to do a whole bunch of other things. She helped start a charter school in New York City. She worked for the UN, UNDP, doing work in Latin America. She did some other stuff in human rights around the world. She went back to Columbia and got her master's from the School of International Studies there. But in between that, she couldn't get out of her head this notion of women baking. So at night, she signed up for a Master's Baker Certificate program. It's wild. It's such an incredible story. And so she did the whole certificate program. She apprenticed at a very famous chef who works at a very famous New York restaurant. Actually, somebody took me there many years ago, and it's like one of those Michelin star rated restaurants called Restaurant Danielle, like fancy restaurant. And she was the first woman ever to be a master baker at this restaurant. It's just amazing. So she basically, over the course of 5 to 7 years, started with that weird miscommunication with her friend, to something that, through her travels around the world working in international development, ed reform, took it upon herself to learn what baking is like. And now, as president and CEO of Hot Bread Kitchen, is working with 90, 100 women in New York City selling millions of dollars of products that preserve their baking tradition, but more importantly, lifts them up and out of poverty. So I think it's a wonderful narrative arc of how you eventually get there, but part of it is always listening to that thing in your head, even if it doesn't make sense at the time, right? So last but not least, I want to talk about one more fellow who illustrates sort of the last couple of principles we talk about at Work on Purpose, called Be Bold. It's just a mantra. Go out into the world, and whatever you do, be bold. So the principles there is immerse yourself boldly. Become an expert in the work you are most drawn to. What has always impressed me about social entrepreneurs that I've worked with at Echoing Green is they are always the smartest person in the room about their issue. And that has nothing to do with academic pedigree. They inhabit their issue, they live it, they breathe it, they get underneath it, and they just know it. And they're 3 steps ahead of everybody else in the room. And just to show you that, again, it has nothing to do with all the wonderful degrees you all have in this room, there is a Echoing Green fellow, an incredible man called John Thompson. John must be about my age, he must be in his 50s. John spent 18 years in Angola. And for those of you who know anything about the criminal justice system in this country, it is a pretty notorious prison in New Orleans, right? Big death row inmate population. John spent 18 years on death row, and twice in those 18 years came within 29 days of being executed. Okay, that's awful enough, it's scary enough, but executed for a crime he did not commit. Completely innocent. And the only reason John is with us today is because a New Orleans prosecutor on his deathbed confessed that he had hidden some vital evidence that would have exonerated John. And thank God for the work of people like Barry Scheck and the Innocence Project, who worked tirelessly to exonerate John and get him out of prison. So John, when he got his life back and was trying to rebuild his life, saw how difficult it was for men like him to try to get reintegrated into society, but ended up coming to Echoing Green, got seed funding to start a program called Resurrection After Exoneration. And it basically is a program that helps work with the exonerated or the long-term incarcerated to help them develop the soft skills and the hard skills they need to get back onto the path of some sort of normalcy. Now, mind you, John never finished high school. He spent 18 years on death row. But I guarantee you, you sit in this room with John, he is the smartest person, the most knowledgeable person on reentry, what it means, how you navigate it, than anyone I've ever met. So it's a call to action to you all. I don't care what issue you decide to focus on, but know it cold. And you don't have to go to graduate school to do it, but you got to figure out how to accumulate that experience, that knowledge, in the way that makes sense for you. And it's vital. If you're ever going to move the needle on these problems, you got to be great at it. So bold immersion, just bathe yourself in this stuff. Another principle we talk about, fear means go. Fear and shame, and I heard somebody talking about, I don't know whether it was Sam or somebody saying you had a group talking to you all about shame. Fear is a really powerful tool. Shame is a really powerful tool that society will use to prevent you from doing something. So they're going to say, oh, you're such a nice young man. You're so young. You've got this crazy idea. You're a little too young. It's a little too crazy. That is really sort of insidious and powerful, because it makes you start to question yourself. You say, well, maybe I am too young, and there are people who have been working on this for 30 years. They know far better than I do. Do not listen. So do not listen to those external voices, because the status quo is really good at maintaining itself. The status quo loves the status quo because it keeps it in power. Your job is to turn it off. Don't listen to it. But even more importantly, that voice in your head that says, oh, I'm a little too young. I don't know as much as that older person sitting next to me, or maybe I need to think about it a little bit more. You really got to manage the fear, because it will paralyze you. There's just too much work to do. You got to get up. You got to get over it. Again, I wish somebody had told me that 30 years ago, because I spent a lot of time refusing to take those steps forward because I was just too afraid. Think big. Again, it is a really perilous time for our planet. We got climate change issues. We got global health issues. We got economic issues. You all are going to have to fundamentally redesign the flow of capital, how we allocate resources, what our institutions need to look like to regain the trust of our citizens. You all have to do that work, and it's not going to necessarily be incremental steps that are going to be work. We're going to have to shift some paradigms here. So release yourself, free yourself to really think big and boldly about some of this work. And then, you know, it's funny that I come to you before and I'm about to talk to you all about Echoing Green as a funder of social entrepreneurs. Your generation has gotten really enamored with entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship, but most human beings are not entrepreneurial. Human beings have existed for 100,000 years because we're not entrepreneurial. We're risk averse. We're creatures who have managed to survive in the world because we don't take all that many chances. So most of us physiologically, temperamentally, are not entrepreneurial, and it's okay. It's really okay. You don't need to start something to be a success. Go be a great CFO. Go be a great COO. Go be an incredible teacher. Go be an incredible global health worker, but just be the best at that you can be. But doesn't mean you can't think entrepreneurially, right? And what that really means, I think, on a practical level, is you should always be questioning. Just because something is, doesn't mean that's the right way for it to be. Sometimes it just happens because we get too lazy as people and institutions to think about doing anything differently. So my one, another call to action is always say, why are we doing it this way? Why does it have to be done this way? And even that exercise, that discipline, can help to shake loose some of the cobwebs of these institutions that are kind of heavy, bureaucratic, old school. And again, that's part of your role to play. A great example of that is a great Echoing Green fellow, a guy named Mark Hannes. Mark was a Swarthmore College student a couple years ago, was reading about the genocide in Congo while he was sitting at a dormitory cafeteria like the one where we just had lunch, and basically said, how in the world are we not standing up and doing something about this genocide? And basically started talking to his friends in class saying, we should really do something about this. And he was all of 19, 20 years old. But one of his first actions was like, I need to talk to Colin Powell about this. At the time, he was Secretary of State. So it's crazy. I love it. Bold. Talk about bold. He spent one night typing in all the different iterations for what he thought Colin Powell's email address would be, and also did it for Bill Gates. From what I understand, he didn't figure out what Colin Powell's email address, but he got through to Bill Gates. And Bill Gates' security people actually, he got in touch with him because they thought he was like a stalker or some crazy guy. But brilliant. He got in touch with Bill Gates and said, I need to talk to you as a philanthropist about this genocide that's happening. So be bold. Go out there. Why not do it? And at the end of sort of this boldness, sort of stepping out there, not letting fear get in your way, started this amazing grassroots organization of young people like you called Genocide Intervention Network, which became the largest student-run permanent anti-genocide constituency, had student chapters all over the world, and got Congress to pass a number of policy measures to get companies to divest who were doing business in the Congo, and really was an extraordinarily successful social entrepreneur. He actually is spending this year as a White House fellow working for Vice President Joe Biden, sort of taking all he learned as a social entrepreneur and now trying to impact the policy process. So an example of just stepping out there, not letting fear get in the way, not sort of allowing people to tell you that you guys are too young, that you're too inexperienced, you just got to do it. So last but not least, I'm going to totally plug Echoing Green. For those of you who don't know it, just sort of keep us in mind. We're not going anywhere. If you ever find yourself interested in starting a social enterprise like GHC or Gardens for Health International, look us up. So Echoing Green was founded 25 years ago by a private equity firm. And they basically said, we've been phenomenally successful as venture capitalists, as private equity investors. We've made a lot of money investing in entrepreneurs, working with them, supporting them, and getting tremendous financial returns on investment. And their genius was, well, what if we did the same thing for people who are not looking for a financial return on investment, but what if we did the same thing with people who wanted a social return on investment? And that was their brilliant insight. So 25 years ago, they started this very small angel fund that every year said, we're going to give money to some young people who are fearless, who've got ideas for change, who are passionate, and let's see what happens. So since 1987, Echoing Green has invested in almost close to 600 social entrepreneurs who are working in 50 countries around the world. And even if some of you have not heard of Echoing Green, I have to tell you, the organization has a phenomenal track record of picking some of the best next-gen social entrepreneurs around the world. Obviously, you know Barbara and Global Health Corps, you know Julie and Emma from Gardens for Health International, Raj and Peter from Teatine Health. But when you look back from my generation of Echoing Green Fellows, we invested in people like Wendy Kopp and Teach for America. Wendy had written her senior thesis on this idea of an urban teachers corps. Her senior thesis advisor said, oh, that's kind of an interesting idea. It won't work, but isn't that an interesting idea? Here you have now a $200 million plus per year social enterprise taking on education reform. People like Sarah Horowitz, who was a labor lawyer, the daughter of a labor lawyer. Her granddad was a vice president of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. Sarah has started something called Freelancers Union. You probably haven't heard of it necessarily, but it is a $100 million per year social enterprise that provides affordable health care to independent workers, part-time workers, and contractual workers, and is now an integral part of the Affordable Care Act. Just last year, the federal government awarded Freelancers Union a $340 million loan guarantee to help stand up one of these health exchanges that is going to come online in the next couple of years to ensure the many millions of Americans who are going to be brought into the healthcare system. Someone you may have heard of, Michelle Obama, who got money from Echoing Green 23 years ago to start the Chicago office of Public Allies as she was leaving her career in corporate law to begin a career in social change. Angel Taveras, who is the mayor of Providence, Rhode Island, the city's first Latino mayor, started an after-school program in Providence in the same housing project in which he grew up. And I actually think Angel is a great example of social entrepreneurship and how next generation unfolds. You know, people, and I'll talk in a minute about how do we define success at Echoing Green. You might look at Angel Taveras and say, well, does Echoing Green consider Angel a success because his project failed? It only lasted for like 2 years after he got the Echoing Green Fellowship. But I would say he was absolutely an incredible investment by Echoing Green back in 1993. Even though his after-school enrichment program didn't work, Angel went off to law school, to Georgetown Law, came back to Providence, became a housing judge, got involved in local politics, and again, was elected 2.5 years ago as the city's first Latino mayor. And it was interesting, like, I want to say 3 months ago, I was turning on some morning news show on MSNBC, and I see Angel on TV, and I was like, oh, what's Angel doing on TV? And, oh, what's Angel doing with Mayor Michael Bloomberg? So it turns out that Mayor Bloomberg every year has started something called the Mayor's Challenge, where he gives out $5 million to the mayor who's got the best idea to improve his or her city. And like this past year, like 350 mayors from around the country applied for this $5 million award. Well, Angel got the $5 million for Providence, Rhode Island, and he ended up getting the money to start a literacy program for low-income 4-year-olds. And you can't tell us, and in fact I've talked to Angel about it, can't tell us that his experiences from 20-some years ago trying to do a literacy and academic enrichment program for low-income kids in the housing project in which he grew up didn't inform and color his entire professional trajectory. So for Echoing Green, we look at that as an extraordinary success, even though the organization he founded is still not in existence. We have funded a ton of global organizations, and I know a lot of you are from countries outside of the U.S. We'd love to do more funding. We funded groups like the African Leadership Academy, a Pan-African boarding school, working with young people from across the continent of Africa to prepare them for next generation leadership. We funded an amazing community development organization in Cabrera called Shining Hope for Communities, which not only runs the first tuition-free girls' school in Cabrera, it also runs a health clinic that is now serving about 30,000 residents a year. We were funders of SKS Microfinance, the fastest growing microcredit institution in the world, gave out about $5 billion in microloans to 5 million plus women across India. And that gives you a sense of sort of the breadth and depth of what we fund. So just so you remember, once a year, every January, we put out a call to young people around the world like you and say, if you've got an idea for a new organization and you haven't like found another organization already doing it better that you can go to work for, but you really think you got to start something new, we ask you to apply to us. And through this social business plan competition, we ultimately award about 20 grants per year It's about $150,000 worth of cash and in-kind supports to help you start your new social enterprises. We give you health insurance. We give you professional development stipend. We introduce you to the Echoing Green Network. And we help these young people try to make a go of their social change organizations. And the last thing I will say, which you guys are really sort of on the cutting edge of, we don't care whether you're starting a not-for-profit organization or a for-profit organization. You can start a double bottom line business, a triple bottom line business, but as long as you've got an explicitly social change mission, that is our business. We are social change angel investors. So keep an eye out for us. We'd love to work with you all over time. But even if you don't start something new, not necessary. There are a lot of great organizations. Your goal is to find out where you fit best and really get to work. So that's social entrepreneurship. That's Echoing Green. I think I'll open it up for questions, and I can talk about anything you guys want. I can tell you more about Echoing Green, whatever makes sense for you guys. Yes. Social entrepreneurs, I think the trajectory is not all that different from all entrepreneurs, for-profit entrepreneurs. At the angel stage, it is all about friends and family. You hear entrepreneurs talk about friends and family round. It is all about hitting up your networks hard. So if you're starting something and you have not asked your parents, your brother, your sister, your uncle, your aunts, everybody you went to school with, you're doing something wrong. And it really is about finding those people closest to you, with the most connection to you, because they're the ones who are going to invest. Entrepreneurs at the earliest stage, when we invest, there's no organization there. It's about investing in you as the person. So those who care about you most are obviously the most logical place to start. So it is all about friends and family. Once you get to more institutional investors, they want to see audited financial statements. They want to see maybe proof of concept. So you really got to focus very heavily on individuals, those with a connection to you. That's how you get it done. No other way to do it. Yep. Exactly. So we have a very specific theory of change. So first of all, I know the U.S. context best. Like, there are over 1.5 million nonprofits in this country. It is way too many. They're all, for the most part, all under-resourced, a lot of duplication, a lot of inefficiency. A lot of them should probably go away. I mean, it's just really a tough, fragmented, balkanized ecosystem. I don't know if the same thing is true in other countries, but certainly the case in the U.S. So there are way too many nonprofit organizations, and most people should not be starting one. But Echoing Green's theory of change, I'll share it with you, and you can see if it's justified. But we are not, and I'll be very clear about this, Echoing Green is not in the business of funding yet another new organization. We are in the business of funding social innovation, game-changing ideas, if they can work, who could potentially shift the paradigm of the way that a particular field is doing business. And the example I always give is, for many years, the ed reform movement is very strong in this country. So every year we get tons of applications. I want to start a charter school. I want to start a new ed program. We turn away the vast majority of them, and our philosophy is only if you can make the case for why your idea has the potential to shift the way the business is being done in your space do we want to talk to you. And there are those who, and I agree with this definition, who say that social innovation is all about process or products that lead to dramatic and not just incremental gains in a system's performance, right? So it's not about sending to us a program that says, I'm going to reduce high school dropout by 10%. Okay, that's okay, but that's not for Echoing Green. If you say, I think I've got a program model that can reduce high school dropout by 40%, that's game changing. That's when you come to Echoing Green. And in the ed reform space, the example I use are two 1998 Echoing Green Fellows, Raj Vinakoda and Eric Adler, who started the Seed School, which is this country's first urban boarding school. You know, for many years, people had tried to start college preparatory inner city boarding schools, but nobody could figure out the financing. They couldn't figure out how to make policy change so public dollars would flow to fund a boarding school. Nobody could get loans to build a facility, but these guys figured out how to get the largest nonprofit loan at the time from Bank of America to build the state-of-the-art facility in inner city DC. They also figured out how to work with the DC City Council to change the law so that public school dollars would go to these boarding school kids. That's game-changing. So the notion that you've got an inner city college preparatory boarding school that not only got 100% of these kids to college, but also was an economic development tool for this particular inner city neighborhood. That's what we're looking for. And our belief is change is hard. The status quo is a brutally oppressive force. And most new ideas fail in part because the status quo will do its best to put its boot on the neck of that new idea. So Echoing Green thinks if we can provide a little bit of protection in terms of money, technical assistance, access to a network, to give these ideas just a hope of seeing the light of day and flourishing, that is our job to do. So that is our very specific theory of change. Yeah. Sure. Sure. That's a really good point. And I think your question speaks to the changes that Echoing Green are going through. So I'll first start by saying that Echoing Green invests in the individual, right? So there are some investors, some funders who look at the organization or who look at the idea. We look at the person, right? Because when they apply to us, most people are still working a full-time job, they have this idea, or they just started working on it, and there's no there yet. So we deeply believe if you find the right person and you back them, that is our leverage point. And honestly, you know, by the time Barbara's proposal for Global Health Corps looked very different today when she applied. And your business plan is only as relevant as the day, the week, and any good entrepreneur will iterate, will throw out the business plan 10, 20 times, and has to be very facile in sort of figuring out how conditions are changing around her and figuring out how to change the organization. So we invest in you. We care about your organization and your idea, but we care more about you. But when you look at the social entrepreneurship landscape, there are some funders like us who focus on the individual mostly. There are some funders who actually do care more about the organization and its potential to scale. There are some that focus mostly on the idea. And there's no right or wrong answer, it's just our approach. So as you sort of file away Echoing Green in your head, we're the group that invests in the human capital. We believe in the person. And I will say that, again, going back to our approach, our philosophy, there are many funders in the world who focus on a particular country or city or program area. Echoing Green is very deliberately agnostic. We fund anywhere in the world. We will fund any idea as long as it's about deep social change. And part of the reason that we do it is because we're trying to take on the status quo. And we believe that I was a history of science major in college. There's a very famous historian of college, a guy named Thomas Kuhn, who wrote a very famous book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions and How Do Revolutions Happen. Revolutions happen not incrementally, but they happen when a paradigm shift happens and you shake things up. But one of his really sharp analyses was that, again, the status quo is really great at tamping down on innovation. And, you know, people in ed reform, even though they mean to do well, they have a specific approach. Here's the way we think ed reform should be done. Here's the way we're doing it now. Echoing Green stands apart from that and says, well, maybe that's not the way you should be done. And by us being generalists and not having a particular point of view, but saying if you can make the case of why you should be given money to try out your new idea to shake up a system, we're going to give you the money. And I have always found that very compelling, very persuasive, and very powerful. And I will say when we started, most of what we were funding was U.S.-based or even U.S. citizens who were doing work abroad. Increasingly, we're working with non-U.S. leaders doing work outside of the U.S. because that's where a lot of the most exciting energy is coming from social entrepreneurship today. So we're way more global than we were even, 10 years ago, and we think that will only continue because some of the coolest stuff we're seeing is coming out of Africa, coming out of Asia. We just funded our first fellow in China who's doing some really cool stuff, and we think that in the next 25 years we'll probably be doing a lot more of that. But at the end of the day, we invest in the person because we think backing next-gen leaders is a really powerful force for change. Yes, so I would say some of the key trends, okay, so one of the key trends that I'm really excited about is, even 5-6 years ago, I would go to places, nobody had ever heard of Echoing Green, nobody had even heard of social entrepreneurship, and they're like, well, social what, echoing what? And it's just been an incredible explosion of interest in the last couple of years. In 2007, Nick Kristof, the New York Times op-ed writer, wrote an article from Davos, the World Economic Forum, and he says, I'm in Davos, and you can't walk down the hall without bumping into a king or a prime minister or a corporate titan. And he said, but the most interesting people at Davos are these do-gooders with spreadsheets, which he called social entrepreneurs. And again, nobody had ever been talking about social entrepreneurship until Nick Kristof and others started talking about this new breed of social sector change agent. And it's interesting, if you did like a LexisNexis search back in 2001, there were maybe like 300 articles on social entrepreneurs. Like last year alone, there were close to 4,000 articles on social entrepreneurship. So this thing has just arrived. And a couple things to note. Number one, it has captured the attention of your generation. Here in the U.S. alone, there are 80 million millennials. There's something about your generation, the way you were raised, you're global citizens of the highest order, your relationship with technology has made you global citizens, has exposed you to things that my generation was never exposed to. You're incredibly tolerant and inclusive in a way that other generations weren't. You want change, but you're not sort of revolutionary and anti-authoritarian. Like, you think the system can be fixed and maybe sometimes it's okay to work within the system, unlike a lot of the folks from the 60s. So you have a lot of interesting qualities that tease you up to be really potentially powerful change agents. So there's something generationally and demographically important about you all. I think you can't undercut the role of technology and the way that you guys are going to drive social change. One of the big knocks on social change efforts is they've been too small, they've been under-resourced. In some ways, technology has allowed you to think about scale propositions that were just unheard of. The fact that through change.org, if you get 100,000 signatures, 1 million signatures, you can change things overnight. That is a new tool in your arsenal. That's really powerful, and we're seeing more technologically based ideas than we did. Another really, really, really big trend for us is this whole notion of impact investing. The idea that you can use for-profit capital to solve environmental and social problems at scale. So for many years, if you talk to some of the most important business leaders in the world, and I actually was at a conference once listening to Mr. Warren Buffett and some other like really big deals in the world of business, who said, I don't get impact investing. He says, like, I make my business decisions on this hand, and I do my philanthropy on the other hand, and I don't understand why you would ever mix the two. It doesn't make sense to me. But there's a whole new generation of business leader and social sector leader who says that's the wrong way to think about it. Our problems are so big that there's not enough philanthropic capital to make a dent in any of these problems. It just doesn't work. Here in the U.S., there's about $300 billion per year we spend on social problems. There are trillions of dollars sitting in for-profit capital markets. If you all could figure out how to tap into that and apply some of that to solving problems, that's how we move the needle. And there is a whole trend afoot, again, called impact investing. that investment banks are starting to pay attention to, that business schools are starting to pay attention to. Echoing Green, in fact, just hired its first full-time impact investing professional. She starts on Monday at Echoing Green. This is a really important trend to watch. So even if you all leave the social sector or the nonprofit sector, you all will be doing your work very differently. And the hallmark of social entrepreneurship is the blurring of boundaries between the state, the market, and the social sector. Far too long, all of the different actors worked in silos. Our problems are too big and too complex to be siloed entities. So I think the biggest trend is we're all starting to talk more to one another and to think more collaboratively about the work to solve social problems. And I think that's the most important trend to focus on in social entrepreneurship. And I would say if I came back in 20 years, will I be here in 20? Hopefully I'd be here in 20 years. You all would probably have a very interesting career trajectory where you are as likely to be working in a nonprofit for a few years as going to work for a big company for a few years to maybe start a new venture, a double bottom line or triple bottom line business. That's the wave of the future. So those are some of the key trends to keep an eye on. In terms of terminology, double bottom line and triple bottom line apply to not only seeking a financial return on the investment of those dollars, but also an environmental return and a social return. So traditionally, people talk about a double bottom line business as a business that is seeking financial returns on the capital as well as environmental returns. A triple bottom line business would be financial returns on investments, social return, and environmental return. So a company that is looking at its carbon footprint, a company that's looking at its workers' rights policies and the impact it makes on the community, and not just what is the profit margin. So again, we invest in the individual. We don't care we do care, but our primary focus is not the organization. So interestingly, if you look at all of Echoing Green's business plan proposals, prior to 2007, literally 99.99% of all of the applications we get every year, so 10,000 plus, were all traditional 501c3s. People apply to us starting nonprofit organizations. Since 2007, every year, 30 to 40% of the ideas we're seeing are now proposing double bottom line or triple bottom line businesses. So for example, 2 years ago, we invested in a young man, Joel Jackson. Joel he's from Britain, had been an international aid worker in Africa. I think he was in Kenya, and worked in rural Kenya and spent a ton of time just sort of waiting to get from point A to point B because the infrastructure of the roads was difficult, making it difficult for vehicles to traverse the roads. He saw produce sort of spoiling because it couldn't get from point A to point B fast enough. He applied to us to start a company called Mobius Motors, which is a for-profit car manufacturing business that has built these low-cost vehicles that can handle the tough infrastructure of rural communities. It looks like a Hummer, a modified Hummer. It's got really interesting design elements. They've gotten the price point down to $6,000, and they've already gotten pre-orders for over 100 of these vehicles. It's a for-profit company. He has raised a couple $1 million from traditional for-profit investors in addition to Echoing Green, but you can make the case, if he can make this work and get a financial return on investment, he could have a huge social return on investment in terms of economic development, social mobility. So that's what Echoing Green has really looked like in the past couple of years. Does that make sense? Yeah. That's a great question. Thank you. And I meant to mention that earlier. So again, we are such an early stage investor, sort of figuring out like what does success look like has been a really difficult conversation for us because we're so early stage and how much credit do we claim for Wendy Kopp at Teach for America, who now has an annual budget of $250 million? We invested in her when she was a college graduate who owned one business suit and one pair of pantyhose. Like, can you say what difference Equity Green makes? So we have struggled mightily to figure out what our impact metrics are. So let me share them with you, and you can see if they make sense to you. So in aggregate, I can tell you that, again, we funded about 600 or so of these social entrepreneurs working in 50-some countries around the world. About 85% of them have remained in the social sector in key leadership positions. I think that's a really powerful stat. So these are the best and the brightest like you who could have gone to Wall Street. They could have gone to McKinsey. They could have done anything. But they decided to devote their intellectual capital, their passion, to trying to solve problems. So boy, do I think it's a big deal that Michelle Obama was an Equity Green fellow. And the fact that this administration set up the first ever White House Office of Social Innovation and Civic Participation, that's like a really big deal. And so again, we think this leadership development pipeline that we're creating of young leaders who care about social change really matters. That's one thing. The second thing I will say is that we've got an organizational sustainability rate of about 67%. Most new businesses fail. It is really hard to start a new business. They just don't work. You can't get the capital. You can't figure it out. It's just too difficult. But the fact that 2 out of 3 of the organizations we seed are sustainable in the short, medium, long term, that's a really good hit rate for new business development. And then last but not least, dollars in, dollars out. We are a very small fund, and even though we've been at this for 25 years, we've only collectively invested about $31 million in these 600 or so social entrepreneurs. Well, they've gone on to raise a couple of $1 billion for specifically social change ideas. That's a huge social return on investment. And if you just looked at the annual reports of even like our 10 largest portfolio organizations, they're raising $700 million a year, just the top 10 largest alone. So the notion that more and more of these dollars are being directed towards social change efforts, we think is a really important metric. So that's sort of an aggregate. We also are very hands-on investors. So it's not just about getting the money, but once you get the money, you become a member of the community, and we do what we can to try to help you get your venture farther faster. So if you were to come into the office, I would show you a spreadsheet, what we call a diagnostic tool of all of the fellows in the Equity Green community, and some are green light, some are yellow light, some are red light, where we track them along 7 organizational development metrics. How are they doing in fundraising? How are they doing in terms of executing against their business plan? How are they doing in terms of board development? And for those who are in the red light zone, we try to devote more resources to help get them back on track. But we did a study a couple of years ago with some NYU grad students who did a really interesting study where we looked at the Equity Green fellows we supported, and then we looked at those finalists for the fellowship that we thought were good enough to get the Equity Green Fellowship, but after we interviewed them, they weren't quite there. We went back and found them a couple years later and said, well, what happened to them? We thought they were really darn good, and we flew them to New York to meet them, but they didn't quite pass muster. So we said, well, let's see what happened to them, and by comparing their progress with the Equity Green Fellows, maybe we can figure out the difference that Equity Green has made. And fully 40% of those that we sent away without the fellowship just never started the idea. So the idea died on the vine. The organization never got up and running. So Equity Green made a life or death difference to some of these organizations. And for those that started without our help, our fellows got farther faster on every organizational development metric in a statistically significant way. So essentially, we look very much like an accelerator, an impact accelerator. So that's how we talk about impact. But I would say increasingly by trying to do more work, like our work on purpose work, is to provide you as young people with the tools and the language and the belief that you can be next generation change agents. Because look, I'll go back to my roots as a social justice person. Social movements work because they drive large scale behavior change. And it is only when collectively you all say, enough on climate change, enough on societal inequities that make the difference between the have and have-nots unsustainable. And it's only when enough people and enough societies say it's no longer acceptable do you start to move the needle. And that's what social movements are all about. So I think increasingly echoing green as trying to be a support mechanism for young people like you, many of whom we'll never work with because you won't start something, you won't apply to us. But how do we get you prepared to take on that leadership mantle to basically say, not working the way we're doing it, we got to change things. And again, to me, at the end of the day, when social movements like the global health equity movement start to pick up steam and make a difference, that's really successful. And then I know I'm going on too long, but I do, again, the power of these social movements. Did anybody, who saw the documentary Waiting for Superman? Did anybody? Okay. So it's basically a documentary about education reform efforts in this country. And, you know, we can quibble about some of the issues with the documentary, but to me, the most powerful line in the documentary was when Jeff Canada, an amazing, one of the most incredible social entrepreneurs in the world, works up in Harlem, runs something called Harlem's Children's Zone, was sort of talking about the work that he was doing, about how part of the success of the ed reform movement is that in my generation, you might look at black and brown kids and your default position was, well, these kids can't learn. Nobody says that, or very few people say that now. We know these children can learn. The struggle now is to get the resources in place to help them learn. The sea change in that attitude that you didn't presuppose what that kid's life outcomes are going to be, that is part of the success of the ed reform social movement. And that's what we need to think more about. And it's hard to measure that, but behavior change is a critical part of how you all will move the needle on some of these problems. Oh, yeah. Okay, yes. So you're talking about how the work we do relates to government? Yeah. How do we do? So again, I will go back to, we fund individuals, so we don't fund existing institutions, we fund individuals. But over the years, we have funded a number of social entrepreneurs who are focused on governmental change at a very high level. So maybe one of the best examples, we funded a great social entrepreneur, a guy named C.V. Madhukar from India, who started something called PRS, which stands for Parliamentary Research Service. So here in the U.S., there's something called CRS, or the Congressional Research Service. Anytime sort of a bill or an issue comes up for debate in our Congress, you've got the CRS that has a lot of really smart people, a lot of researchers, academics, who put a lot of work into researching an issue and providing policy briefs to members of Congress. In India, nothing like that existed. So CV would always talk about like billion-dollar public utility legislation that would be talked about on the floor of Parliament with absolutely no background supporting material. And it was leading to terrible policy. So through his work in founding PRS, you now have this really, really important adjunct to government service that I would argue is really making a difference. We also have funded social entrepreneurs that are basically putting pressure on governments to do their work better. So, for example, we funded an incredible human rights advocate, a woman named Natalie Bridgman, who works with large multinational, multilateral organizations like the World Health Organization, the World Bank, to use some of their examination ombudsman's process to give a voice to marginalized populations who are not getting their voices heard at sort of the governmental level. So the example she always used is there is a ton of development happening in China, especially development that is having terrible adverse environmental effects. And she's brought a couple of examination suits before the World Bank that takes the voices and the concerns of local populations that are being displaced, that are being hurt as a result of some of these large-scale development projects, and gives them a voice to their governments. There's some of these multilateral organizations. So that's unique examples of social entrepreneurs who are working to change government, but you raise a really important point, and I'll end with this. Social entrepreneurship as a movement is still very young. It's only about 30 years old, and we don't have time to go into this, but people sort of trace the beginnings of the movement only back to 1980. And social entrepreneurship sprang up in part because frustrated people said, what in the world is going on? The government doesn't work anymore. It's letting us down. Our institutions, our financial institutions are letting us down. Our political institutions are letting us down. We can't count on any of those. We as citizens are going to have to do it ourselves. Hence was born this notion of social entrepreneurship. The movement was propelled because people started looking at incredibly successful entrepreneurs like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos from Amazon and said, well, if they can do it as entrepreneurs making money, why can't we be entrepreneurs, but instead of making money, we make social change? So there are a lot of factors that came together that spurred the social entrepreneurship movement, but for the first 20 years of the movement, it was very antagonistic towards government. That government doesn't work, so why should we interact with it? Only recently have social entrepreneurs come to recognize that there is no bigger entity with more resources and more sort of combined power and levers to make change than the government. So it's been a really interesting trend in the past couple of years to see social entrepreneurs who for years wouldn't go near policymakers, wouldn't go near governments, recognizing that if you want to get to scale and solve these problems, you actually have to work with government sometime. So I would say that's a really important trend, and my hope is that in years to come, more social entrepreneurs will actually go into government and become policy entrepreneurs, because that, to me, would be a wonderful way to sort of shake up some of the bureaucratic inertia. But more and more we recognize you got to work in concert with government, as well as sometimes fight against government. You got to do both. Yeah.